Today I'd like to continue our journey through the book of Deuteronomy. We've been looking at some of the different laws and customs that Moses is sharing with the people before they enter the promised land. At this point, we're in chapter 13 of the book, and in chapter 13, Moses warns about false prophets, and he even uses the term dreamers who will turn you away from God. So these false prophets will come with messages, and supposedly they will say these are things that God has shared with me, and I want to share them with you. And all of a sudden, it's like, well, wait a minute, is this really something that is in accordance with what God wants, or are these people just making things up and sharing things? And Moses uses the term dreamers as sort of a negative. When we think of dreams in the Bible, we think of course, Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, Joseph, one of the patriarchs. We think of also Joseph, the stepfather or foster father of Jesus. And we think of those dreams as being very powerful, as having messages from God. But in this sense, Moses is saying, no, a dreamer is somebody who really is off base, and they're sharing their own dreams, which might be nice, which might be interesting, it's, hey, that's your dream, but it's not really a message from God. So Moses said, beware of that. The false prophets, according to Moses, should be killed, as well as anyone else who leads you away from God. Even your family members, they should be stoned to death. That's how seriously this relationship with God is taken. Of course, in an age where now we are against capital punishment, we look back at that and say that's kind of extreme. But I think the idea was that we should take our faith seriously. We should take following God seriously. Because if we don't, we can be easily led astray and into things that are really not good and productive for us as a tribe, for us as a family, for us as a nation. These things won't help us. So we must set a standard here. We would say, of course, instead of them being stoned to death, instead of them being killed, just expose them as false prophets. Have a dialogue with them. Have a dialogue with others and show where they are leading you away from God, and say this is not someone that you should follow. But there's always that tension with a false prophet. We see it in our own age, of course, with different false prophets and leaders, and we find out that they're just trying to make money off of us. They're scam artists, and so we're leery of them. Of course, we wouldn't stone them to death, but of course, many times, if there's fraud involved, they do wind up in prison. But we don't go to that extent of actually killing somebody for giving us a false message or misleading us in any way. Also, Moses talks about the inhabitants of the city where the people have been led astray by scoundrels. And if the whole city has been led astray, Moses said it's good to destroy the city because of what could happen. And because these scoundrels many times will worship false gods, and they will lead you astray in their practices and lead you into other things. And so the city should be destroyed. And even to the extent of destroying the cattle. Interesting, the concept here of what we call a social sin. Many times we look at sin as a very individual thing. This person has committed a sin, this other person, it's a personal matter. But what the Bible is raising here in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 13 is a different concept entirely. And that is the concept of what we call a social sin, where this sin has been so woven into the fabric of a society that it becomes very difficult to resist that sin. It has become accepted in that society. Example in today's society, of course, would be when we look back at the institution of slavery. And we say, well, that was an institution that was accepted in certain states, become part of their fabric, and became difficult to resist. We see this in our study of the history of slavery in the United States, for example, where certain faith traditions, for example, in the Catholic religion or other Christian faiths, they found it very difficult in certain sections of the country where that institution was so embedded to resist that institution. So it became a social sin. So what Moses is referring to here is when this false worship, um, when this worship that takes us away from God, and that worship that can even embrace evil, becomes so embedded in a community, and sometimes that whole community has to be destroyed. And we would say today, of course, it becomes difficult to resist a community when sin becomes involved in it. Another, of course, classic example would be the Holocaust in Germany. Imagine yourself being a German at that time. How would you be able to resist that evil that became so embedded in society? And so this issue here that Moses is raising, at first it seems like, well, you're going to destroy a whole city. What's this? It's kind of crazy. But then when we look at what is underneath that, and the idea of embracing sin and embracing false worship and embracing evil, embracing injustice, we look at it in terms of uh, contemporary examples like the war in Ukraine. Imagine if you're a Russian and you want to resist that. Well, you're going to try to resist it, and you go to jail, or you're shot, or resisting something which is an evil, where there's an open act of aggression of this country against another country. They're just trying to invade it and take over part of the country. Um, well, wait a minute here. This is an evil thing. Well, how do I resist it? Well, I'm a Russian. I don't accept it. I think it's wrong. What do I do? Well, my society, unfortunately, as a nation, is embracing this evil and standing for this evil. We even say, gee, the Russians are evil. Russia is evil. Why is Russia doing this? The Germans were evil. Slavery was evil. Why was this happening? But you can see the difficulty as an individual in fighting against that. So this concept in chapter 13 is really very interesting in terms of the question it raises for us. To balance it out, at the end of chapter 13, Moses says, well, if you remain faithful to God, God will multiply you, as God promised to your fathers on oath. So God said, I'm going to remain faithful to you. He asks us to remain faithful to God. So if we remain faithful to God, we will be multiplied. Well, what does that mean? It means that if we do works of justice, if we do loving actions, if we're not selfish, if we help our neighbor, if we try to build up the community, those efforts are multiplied. They become stronger. Just as if we take a path of evil, how that can lead us away from God. Well, these acts of love, these acts of kindness, these acts of caring lead us towards God. Because we're helping our neighbor, we're building our community, we're making our community stronger and better by our actions, by our interventions. So we see here in chapter 13 some really important and significant teachings that Moses is laying out, which at first, when you read it, you might not actually pick up on it. You might say, well, what is Moses talking about here? Destroying a city. He's talking about God multiplying efforts. What does this mean? Well, it means that if we embrace goodness, if we embrace justice, if we embrace what God wants, what we call God's commandments, then that can lead us towards goodness.